The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, Hennepin County Commissioner Mark Andrew, will talk with Robert Rohlf, Director of the Hennepin County Library. They'll discuss the broad spectrum of children's services administered by Hennepin County.
Today we'd like to welcome Commissioner Mark Andrew, Hennepin County Commissioner, to discuss the government's program, Hennepin County government specifically, government programs for children in Hennepin County. As society grows more complex today and people live closer and closer together, according to many sociologists, society separates us more and more into the upper classes and the lower classes. And children are often the victims of the changes that are occurring in our family social structures today. When society fails, the county often becomes the government that must deal with the social fallout, because it's the county that the state mandates many programs for. Hennepin County provides a variety of services for families including child care, health care, foster care, group residences for chemically dependent youth, and many, many more, Commissioner. And these services are often contracted out to other appropriate facilities in the community. I wonder, Commissioner Andrew, if you would please describe some of the county's programs and the county's role in funding and monitoring them for children.
Well, the range of programs that we provide is really almost mind-boggling when you stop to think about it. We provide programs that are in-home, home-based services. We provide residential programs. We provide day treatment programs. And we provide all of those programs to augment other programs that are more institutional in nature. And they would run across the entire gamut of social and corrections services. We've got corrections-based programs. We have got programs that are geared toward mental health services, chemical dependency services, child care services, counseling services, and a wide range of others. I've frequently said when I've talked to people about the kinds of programs we provide in Hennepin County, you find me a social malady out there in the community and I'll find you a Hennepin County program that provides for a solution to the problem.
Does the county generate these programs themselves, or are they generally mandated by the state, or is it a combination?
It's frequently a combination, but it's sort of interesting because depending on how you define the term mandated, county programs are, generally speaking, if you look at the entire county budget, somewhere around 70% of all county operated and funded programs are required either by state law or by federal law. But that number is a little bit slippery because frequently we are required to provide a service, and that part of it is mandated, but the level of service is not mandated. And so Hennepin County almost always provides a level of service that exceeds what is specifically required by law.
When you talk to people in outstate areas, or some now call Greater Minnesota, they seem to, the message I get is other counties provide these services, but they don't provide them at anywhere near the level that Hennepin County does. And the impression then is that the county has to come up with the dollars that make up the difference.
Yeah.
Is that true, or is that another
Well, there's probably
myth?
a little, no, I think there's probably a little bit of truth to that, but I think it's important to make a distinction between a non-urban county, a greater Minnesota county, or an outstate county, however you want to describe that, and a heavily urbanized county where endemic social problems are far more intense. For instance, in our county, we represent about 23% of the population of the state, but about 70% of the serious crimes are committed in our county. Over half of all of the court adjudicated legal cases are processed through Hennepin County. We've got probably 80% of all of the AIDS cases in the healthcare field in Hennepin County, and a disproportionate number of the homeless population. 60% of the state's homeless population is in Hennepin County. And when you're talking about programs for kids, that is also reflected in the pressures being brought to bear on Hennepin County government. We have a disproportionate burden that we take responsibility for in programs that deal with kids.
Are those programs increasing? Or let me phrase it another way. There seems to be an increase in the disruption of family life. And people have said particularly in the minority families, and minority families are very large in Hennepin County. Could you describe some of the Hennepin County programs that deal with this increasing problem, or some people use another word, the social malady?
Yeah, just to pick one, just sort of off the cuff, we've got a number of programs we're operating in the Minneapolis School District right now. Teenage Medical Services is one such program that deals with adolescent kids and provides medical services to kids. In the chemical dependency field, a good example of a program would be a Turning Point program, which focuses on primarily black kids, children and adults, in the Turning Point program, and very intensive hands-on therapy and counseling for chemically dependent black Hennepin County residents. The truth of the matter is that there is a rapidly growing demand for the services that are being provided in Hennepin County. You made mention of some of the problems in the minority community. The problems that we're experiencing both in the minority and in the white communities in Hennepin County are far more complicated, family-oriented, systemic problems than they used to be. It used to be that you'd get a kid who got in trouble because he stole a car. Now you've got a child who's been abused, physically or sexually abused by a parent, with a much higher likelihood that there's been drug or alcohol abuse among other family members, and the kinds of dysfunctional antisocial activities that are being that are being perpetrated by the kids are far more serious crimes than they used to be. They tend to be far more violence prone, and they tend to be far more drug related than they used to be. And I'd also mention that if you're talking just about kids who are being treated, regardless of the cultural or racial heritage of the kids, what we're finding is a far greater tendency to commit crimes that are related to sex. A lot more sex-related offenses being committed out there. So we've put a lot more focus on that kind of a malady, and it's costing a lot more money, of course. But we think that the treatment and the early intervention programs are very cost effective.
Some people have said that, well, we've always had these problems, except they're more out in the open now than they used to be. And others, like a former Minneapolis police chief, used to say, well, the gangs have finally come to the Twin Cities. Those are two really contradictory statements.
And they are contradictory, but there's probably a little bit of truth to both of those. I think in the case of child abuse or neglect, in our child protection office in the county, I think most of the social workers would tell you that some of the reports of child abuse, child physical abuse, or child sexual abuse would not have been reported a decade ago. So I think we're seeing more of a willingness on the part of neighbors and family members to report alleged instances of neglect or abuse. But at the same time, I think because of the more increasingly complex nature of the cases and the family-related dysfunctions, I think there's a lot more of it than there used to be. And as a result, it's far more expensive and has to be dealt with in a different way from the way we used to deal with some of these problems.
Does the county have to deal with these pretty much on its own, or does it have any cooperative relationships with the city of Minneapolis or St. Louis Park or Golden Valley or whatever?
Well, Bob, you touched on something that I think is really the the linchpin of the solution, the long-term solutions to some of these problems, and that is intergovernmental cooperation, and one of my favorite words, collaboration. And I think we're starting to see a lot more collaboration. This TAMS program that I just mentioned, the Teenage Medical Services Program, is a good example of that, where the county is actually joining forces with the school district. You're also seeing that in some of the drug education programs that we're providing in the Minneapolis School District. The importance of collaborating on problems that one level of government alone cannot solve, I do not think can be overstated. I think it's just crucial. Money alone is not going to fix these problems. We have to have a well-coordinated, collaborative approach to solving these problems, especially the problems relating to kids.
Are you getting that kind of cooperation from the various cities?
Well, it's slow moving, and as so frequently the case, I think the general public instinctively is farther along on the curve than the policymakers and the politicians. We're starting to respond. We're seeing a lot more intergovernmental cooperation. I spend much of my time, for instance, in my job dealing with Minneapolis City Council members, school board members, state legislators. Some people might say that's just a strong desire on my part to not be around my colleagues on the county board. But I think the reality is that we need our legislators and our city council members and our school board members and our park board members and our library board members to be cognizant of the fact that the solution to these social problems are in coordinated efforts.
Well, one of the boogeymans you often hear in political discussions in all of this, it seems to be the state. You alluded to the state and its cooperative effort with the city and the county, but I get back to that basic funding question again. The state says you shall do this and so, gives you some money, and then kind of steps aside. And I hear these continuing differences of opinion about how much the state should fund or not fund. And I remember discussions where they said, well, the state's going to take over 100% of all social service funding, for example.
Yeah.
Where are we at that issue?
Well, the state is going to be assuming responsibility in January for some of the cash payment programs, the actual grant amounts themselves, and general assistance, for instance, and some of the cash programs. But the social services, the battered women, the child care, the treatment programs, all of the social programs are going to continue to be, I think, squarely the financial responsibility primarily of the counties. We are actually backsliding. When you talk about federal support or when you talk about state support for social programs, we have gone backwards over the last 10 years. Federal support, Title 20, which is our biggest pot of federal dollars for domestic spending. Since 1981, we have experienced a deterioration of over 60%, not 60% of the actual spending power of the federal dollars we receive. At the same time that has happened, we have experienced such explosive growth in the programs themselves that in some cases the growth has been double digits and even triple digits. For instance, in child care, just to pick one example. In child care, when I was first elected to the county board and took office in 1983, by golly, I promised we were going to put more money into child care support. And in fact, we have. The county has increased its support of child care subsidies 400% since I've been on the county board. I think an admirable effort by almost any measure. The problem is that the demand for subsidized child care in Hennepin County has gone up 1,200%, which means we're really backwards. We have gone backwards since 1983. So we've made, I think, a major commitment to increased support for child care. We've gone backwards. The role that the state plays in these programs, I think, the state has indeed been part of the problem. They've also been part of the solution. The state has done a better job funding specific program areas than the federal government, child care being one example. But the state has also has a nasty tendency to require the counties to carry out programs without providing the funds to do it. For instance, the major mental health initiative for children of the last 20 years. It was called the Children's Mental Health Act. That was enacted by the legislature, really a marvelous piece of legislation. It was authored by Representative Gloria Siegel, and it was a very, very fine piece of legislation. The problem is that in order for that particular children's mental health initiative to become a reality and to be effective will require millions of dollars. And the state legislature only approved roughly $50,000 to Hennepin County for a program that will take literally a few $1,000,000 a year in order for us to comply with the law. So that's a problem we have with a well-meaning legislature crafting sensible public policy, but then not being able to fund that policy. And so that adds more and more burden to the property tax. If we can either comply with the law and raise property taxes, or we can not comply with the law and get in hot water with the legislature and the social service agencies.
Well, I'd heard of the Mental Health Act for Children, and I'd heard that there were funding problems, but I never was certain exactly where the problem was, except, again, the state didn't give it enough money.
Yeah.
Is the county then having a sort of pilot programs that they hope to fund more fully later, or have you just selected a couple of mental health programs that you can fund with the $50,000 and whatever you can levy for?
Mostly, we're probably not doing a whole lot differently from what we were doing in children's mental health at this particular point in time. Our mental health programs for kids were underfunded before the Children's Mental Health Act passed into law. I consider the mental health portion of our social service budget to be really crucial to kids, because I think it offers the hope, if we can intervene early into the lives of these troubled youngsters. I think it offers the same kind of promise that the Head Start programs offer in the field of education, and that is you're gonna eliminate early problems before they actually arise, problems that are likely to impact on the criminal justice system and on the welfare system later in life. And so I think it's really crucial that we secure some funds to do it. But at this point in time, I would say the prospect for getting those funds is not good.
Well, the libraries have felt this impact of the change in the society and the family, with more and more single parents and more children in daycare, and then trying to reach those children so they learn the reading skills and they learn the need for reading while they're kind of in another surrogate home. You mentioned the subsidized daycare. I think to a lot of our audience there may be some confusion. What's the difference between subsidized daycare and what often other people just refer to as daycare?
Okay, that's a good question. Subsidized daycare is child care that's provided, paid for in part or in total by government subsidies based on a family's income levels. And there are generally 2 or 3 streams of funds now available for subsidized child care. One is through the state welfare reform program called STRIDE, which focuses child care subsidies on families that are part of this welfare reform effort, an attempt to get off welfare and into the job force. Another funding stream for child care is prioritized, targeted towards families that are in work or training elsewhere, not necessarily in STRIDE, but in work or training. Generally speaking, the subsidized child care programs serve a few useful purposes. They provide an ability of both parents to get out into the workforce, which I think strengthens the self-image of families, provides obviously badly needed additional funds into the household, and it keeps families off welfare. Subsidized childcare is very effective in keeping families off welfare. We've got a lot of families that, economically speaking, are marginal, and without subsidized daycare, mom couldn't go to work, and therefore they'd end up on some sort of public assistance program. So generally speaking, subsidized childcare is very cost effective.
So the basic test really is an income test.
Yeah.
I mean, there are others, but that's one of them, or
Right.
the basic one.
Right.
The county has had a lot of discussions about contracting services out rather than having services performed by county staff. Are these contract services considered less expensive and therefore a break to the taxpayers? What's the basic rationale and what's the quality control? Or is that a really loaded question?
Is it a really loaded question? Yes, it is.
It's a good question then.
It is an excellent question, but I don't know how specific it can be answered. The truth is that there is no way to empirically measure the cost effectiveness of contracted services as put up against operated programs. In a lot of ways, I really think making a judgment as to what kind of services ought to be operated within the county staff and which services ought to be purchased from outside the staff is really as much an art as it is a science. I think it really just takes some really instinctive judgments and a little healthy dose of common sense. I prefer to see a good, healthy mix in the way we fund our social programs. The Community Services Department of Hennepin County, which provides all of these programs, now has a majority, in fact a healthy majority, roughly 2/3 of all of our services provided in community services, which are contracted out. In 1980, it was about 55 or so % of all of our services were contracted out services, and about 45% were operated by us. Today, it's about 2/3, 1/3, much to the consternation of the unions, I might add. The unions are not happy with that. In a rapidly changing social environment that we are operating within today, I think argues very strongly in support of having a lot of flexibility. And when you're contracting out for services, you're buying flexibility. On the downside, because that's an advantage, but there are disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that you can't monitor quality as well. I think quality control is a truly a very hard to get at issue in contracted services. And sometimes you also make yourself so beholden to the outside provider that they can sort of up the ante on the government unit. So if a motivation was to contract out to save money, if you contract out and put all your marbles in contracting out, it creates the opportunity for them to kind of raise the ante on the county, and maybe you won't save so much money after all. So I think you really need to have a good, healthy mix.
So there's been a rather dramatic shift to more contracting services. Do you think that's going to continue, or do you think it's kind of stabilized now? I realize that's a kind of tough.
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold you to a number, but
Yeah.
what's the trend?
Yeah, I do think it's going to continue for a period of time. I think the public demands it too. I think I think the non-quantifiable influence on policymakers is that their constituents generally like the idea of privatizing. Contracting in a pure sense is not necessarily privatization, but it's moving in that direction of privatizing. And I think there's a lot of public support for that. So I think we're going to see continuation of growth in outside services being bought by government units. But I also think with the restoration, if we get a restoration of federal and state funds, I also feel we're going to see growth in our in-house staff as well.
Well, briefly, Mark, I know that there is some concern that we're creating a whole new industry out there, a cottage industry of social service providers, and they feed on that, kind of on themselves. Is that an unfounded fear?
No, I think it's a responsible policymaker has to be aware of that. But 15 years ago, you had the contracted people saying the same thing about the operated programs. That the social workers were, institutionalizing a lot of these problems, and
bureaucracy was there.
Right. And so I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah. You've mentioned quite a few of the programs, and for the benefit of our viewers, I wondered if you could, for example, suggest what a person might do if they're convinced that their next door neighbor or somebody down at the corner, or even somebody who belongs to some organization that they do, is involved in child abuse. Where do you go? What do you do? The abuser is certainly not going to turn themselves in, although I realize once in a while they do. But normally, how does one get to a county or to a service to help the child?
Well, first of all, it's anyone who has reason to believe that abuse or serious neglect is taking place is obligated not only morally but legally to report instances of suspected abuse to the county authorities. We don't investigate every report of abuse that comes in. Again, our staff people have to be artists in a way. They have to decide what's real and what isn't, and sometimes that's on the force of a single telephone call. We don't have the staff to investigate every single report that comes in. But if they just called the county 348-3000 general information number and asked for Hennepin County Child Protection, they would be immediately connected. And they could fulfill that moral and legal obligation.
So they should really report to the county more than to the local police or dialing 911.
Yeah, although it would get there. 911 would get it to us as well. The communication network is becoming increasingly sophisticated, and again, getting into this collaboration idea that we were talking about, there is a tremendous amount of cooperation that takes place now between the police department and welfare agencies and the emergency services, and we're all pretty well coordinated.
There are comments often made, as they say, out on the street. Some people say they're a myth and some they aren't, and that is that families move to Minnesota to take advantage, particularly of Hennepin County's social service programs. One is, do you think that's true, and how do you answer those criticisms?
Well, there's a certain amount of truth to the fact that people come here from outside the state and end up on welfare. For my part, I consider it to be a legitimate issue. I consider it to be a growing issue. And I know that some of my politically liberal compatriots may not approve of my saying this, but I strongly endorse the idea of a residency requirement, and I always have. I just think that it's unfair for a state that has, in a county, that have provided good quality programs. I just think it's unfair for those states and counties to be expected or be obligated to pay for the neglect of taxing jurisdictions elsewhere. Having said that, I also want to say that people do not necessarily come here just to get on our welfare programs. Our welfare programs here, some of them are fairly generous and some of them are not particularly generous. For instance, AFDC, which is a program primarily for women with children, single women with children or single parent families. The AFDC is a program that pays roughly $450 a month to a single mom with a child. Hardly enough to go out and buy a fancy, flashy new Cadillac on. However, even though we are the 5th highest AFDC grant level state in the country, we did a study a few years ago to look at where people were coming from and ending up on welfare. And you know what we found out? That the 2 states from which we got in-migration from people who ended up on AFDC came from California and Wisconsin, both of which have higher AFDC grant levels. So I'm not saying we're not getting people here from other parts of the country who are ending up on welfare, but I'm saying that the welfare grant level itself is not the major reason. Probably a more significant influence is the excellent job climate we have here and the excellent quality of life and the excellent support services.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Mark. We've been listening to you and explained some very complex issues for the county and for the citizens. Being a county commissioner and trying to deal with social service problems today is not easy. We appreciate your taking the time. To our viewers, I'd like to remind them that the public library is really a preventive social agency. And by virtue of our literacy programs, a collection containing thousands of books, pamphlets, magazines, dealing with everything from how to find a job to how to prepare yourself for family crisis and chaos, the library plays a major role in preventing family problems and in helping people deal with those problems and that crisis once they occur. Once again, I'd like to thank Commissioner Mark Andrew for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mark Andrew and Robert Rohlf. And thank you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.